A Map of Thought, Episode 21, Douglas North. Here is a question that should genuinely bother you. Why do two countries, sitting on similar natural resources, sometimes with similar populations and similar starting points, end up decades later with completely different levels of wealth? Not because one got lucky with oil or gold and the other did not. Douglas North spent his career building an answer, and it won him a Nobel Prize in economics, precisely because the answer turned out to be uncomfortable for anyone who wants a simple story about hard work or natural resources, explaining national success.
So what is the answer, in plain terms?
Institutions. Not buildings, not government agencies specifically, but something closer to the actual rules of the game a society plays. Property laws, contract enforcement, how corrupt or reliable the courts are, whether political power changes hands peacefully or through violence, how easy or hard it is to start a business without paying a bribe. North's core claim is that these rules shape every single economic decision people make, far more than natural resources, climate, or even average education levels ever do. And here is the part that made this genuinely useful, rather than just descriptive. North introduced the idea of transaction costs into this picture properly. The real costs, in time, money, and uncertainty, of actually making a deal happen. Finding a trading partner, verifying they will not cheat you, enforcing the agreement if something goes wrong. In a society with strong institutions, those costs are low, because courts are predictable and property rights are secure. In a society with weak institutions, those costs are enormous. An enormous transaction costs quietly strangle economic activity before it even gets started.
Give us the historical example that made this argument famous.
The comparison between English and Spanish colonization of the Americas, and it is a genuinely striking case. Both empires colonized huge, resource-rich territories starting in roughly the same era. Spain extracted enormous wealth quickly. Silver and gold pulled directly out of Mexico and Peru, funneled back to the crown through a rigid, centralized, extraction-focused colonial system. England, by contrast, especially in its North American colonies, built something messier and slower. Colonies with elected assemblies, secure private property rights, and courts that, however imperfectly, generally enforced contracts between ordinary people, not just crown-favored elites. Centuries later, the long-term wealth outcomes diverged dramatically. The regions built on extractive, centralized institutions ended up, on average, considerably poorer and more unequal than the regions built on institutions protecting broad-based property rights and political participation. North's argument is not that England was simply luckier. It is that the institutional structure itself, put in place early, shaped centuries of subsequent economic development, long after the original colonizers were gone.
Before we move on, I want to push on the Spain comparison a bit further, because it is easy to hear that and assume it was simply about which empire was more benevolent.
Fair pushback, and it is worth being precise, because neither empire was remotely benevolent by modern standards. English colonization involved its own brutal record, including chattel slavery and violent displacement of indigenous populations, and North's argument is not a moral ranking of the colonizers. It is specifically about the structure of the economic institutions each empire happened to build for its own reasons. Spain needed to extract silver and gold quickly and ship it home to fund a distant crown, so it built centralized, extractive institutions optimized for exactly that narrow purpose. England's settler colonies, particularly in places without an existing concentrated source of extractable mineral wealth, ended up needing to attract and retain ordinary settlers willing to build long-term farms and businesses, which meant offering them something Spain never had to offer its colonial subjects: real, enforceable property rights and some genuine voice in local governance. The institutions that emerged were shaped by each empire's own self-interested calculation, not by which one had kinder intentions, and that is exactly why North's argument holds up. Good institutions did not require good intentions. They required a structural incentive to build them.
That raises an obvious question. Once bad institutions get established, why do not they just get fixed?
This is where North's second big idea comes in, path dependence, and it might be the single most quietly important concept in this entire series so far. Path dependence means that once a society heads down a particular institutional path, even a genuinely inefficient one, it becomes remarkably hard to switch tracks, because too many people and organizations have built their entire livelihoods around the existing rules, however flawed those rules are. North's favorite illustration for this, and it has become something of a classic case study, is the QWERTY keyboard layout you are almost certainly typing on right now. That layout was designed in the 1870s specifically to slow typists down, spacing out commonly paired letters to reduce the mechanical jamming that plagued early typewriters. The technical reason for that design disappeared decades ago. Modern keyboards cannot jam the way old mechanical ones did. And yet nearly the entire world still types on a keyboard deliberately engineered to be slower than necessary, because switching now would mean retraining hundreds of millions of typists, replacing enormous amounts of infrastructure, and coordinating a change nobody has enough individual incentive to start alone.
Let us bring that down to something a listener has probably lived through directly.
Think about a company stuck using clunky, outdated internal software. Everyone agrees the newer alternative is better, faster, cheaper. And yet the switch keeps getting delayed year after year, because every department has built its own workarounds around the old system's quirks, because retraining everyone takes real time and money, because the data migration itself is risky, and because no single person wants to be the one who breaks something critical during the transition. The old system persists not because anyone thinks it is good, but because the accumulated cost of everyone's adaptation to it has become its own kind of institutional inertia. That, at the scale of an entire nation's legal and economic system, is exactly what North means by path dependence.
Where does this show up in the world right now, beyond old case studies from the age of empire?
Look at the nations that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. They all started from a remarkably similar point. Decades of centrally planned economies suddenly opened to markets and, at least nominally, democratic politics. 3 decades later, the outcomes have diverged enormously. Some of the Baltic states built genuinely strong property rights, relatively clean courts, and stable democratic institutions fairly quickly, and grew wealthy enough to join the European Union within about a decade. Several Central Asian states, by contrast, kept much of the old centralized, extraction-oriented power structure intact under new labels, and have stayed considerably poorer, with wealth and power concentrated among small, entrenched elites. Same starting point, roughly the same natural resource base in several cases, wildly different institutional paths, wildly different outcomes. This also reframes an entire debate about foreign aid that policymakers are still having right now. For decades, a great deal of international development aid focused mainly on funding infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, on the assumption that resources themselves would generate growth. North's work fueled a genuinely important shift in development economics, arguing that aid poured into a country with weak, corrupt, or extractive institutions tends to get captured by whoever already holds power, producing far less lasting benefit than the same money would produce in a country with strong institutional foundations already in place. That is a big part of why modern development economists talk so much about institutional reform and governance, not just funding levels, when they evaluate whether aid programs are actually likely to work.
And there is a live great power debate this connects to as well.
There genuinely is. Watch the ongoing argument about the Chinese development model compared to Western liberal democratic models. China has produced extraordinary economic growth over the past 4 decades under a system with weaker formal property rights and far less political pluralism than North's framework would traditionally predict as necessary for sustained growth. Some economists argue this shows North's framework was too narrowly focused on Western-style institutions, and that a strong, capable, long-term planning state can substitute for some of what secure private property and democratic accountability normally provide. Others argue China's growth has depended on specific, partial institutional strengths, reasonably secure property rights for businesses even without full political freedom, and that the jury is still genuinely out on whether growth without those broader political institutions can keep compounding indefinitely, or whether it eventually hits a ceiling that institutional weakness alone explains. That argument is not settled, and anyone who tells you it has picked a side rather than read the evidence honestly. Next time, we make one of the biggest jumps of the entire series, all the way down from the institutions of entire nations to something far smaller and far more intimate, the tiny daily interactions between two people that quietly build a sense of who each of them actually is. We meet two thinkers together, George Herbert Mead and his student Herbert Bloomer, and we ask how something as fragile as your own sense of self gets built entirely out of conversation with other people.
See you then.